The sound of a coffin being lowered into the ground is something you never forget. Neither is the sound of your own son changing the locks on your front door 3 hours later. Margaret had been gone for exactly 17 days when we buried her on that gray October morning. The funeral home had done what funeral homes do, made everything look peaceful, dignified, final. The flowers were arranged just so. The pastor spoke about eternal rest and God's plan. People filed past the casket wearing their somber faces, offering me handshakes that lasted a beat too long and words that meant nothing at all. Through it all, Ethan stood beside me in his charcoal suit, Madison's hand resting on his arm like she was anchoring him to something. His wife looked appropriate, I'll give her that. Black dress, minimal jewelry, the kind of composed grief that photographs well. Her parents, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, flanked us on the other side, talking quietly to relatives I barely recognized anymore. The whole thing felt like a performance where I had forgotten my lines. When we got back to the house, our house, the one Margaret and I had lived in for 32 years, I noticed Ethan lingering by his car instead of coming in. Madison was with him, along with her parents, their heads bent together in the kind of urgent whisper that stops when someone approaches. I should have paid attention to that whisper. Inside, the house felt different. Not just empty. Margaret had been in the hospital for 2 weeks before she passed, so I'd grown used to the silence. This was something else. Something shifted, rearranged, claimed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I walked through the living room, where Margaret's reading chair sat exactly where she'd left it, her bookmark still marking page 247 of the mystery novel she'd never finish. The coffee table held the same stack of Better Homes and Gardens magazines she'd been collecting for a garden renovation we'd talked about for next spring. Everything looked right, but nothing felt right. In the kitchen, I found Margaret's coffee mug in the dish drainer, the one with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. It gives it character, she used to say, running her thumb over the imperfection. I picked it up and held it against the light coming through the window she'd hung gingham curtains on 20 years ago. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a power drill coming from the front of the house. I set the mug down carefully and walked toward the sound. Through the window, I could see Ethan on the front porch, a bright yellow DeWalt drill in his hand. He was installing something on my front door, something new, something silver. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I opened the door. What are you doing? He looked up, not startled, just focused, like a man completing a task he'd been planning. Changing the locks, Dad, for security. Security from what? Just security. Mom's gone now. You're here alone. It's smart to update the hardware. I watched him work, the efficient way his hands moved, how he'd clearly done this before. The old lock, the one Margaret and I had installed together when we first moved in, the one that had taken us 3 trips to Home Depot and 2 hours of cursing to get right, lay in pieces on the porch boards. You didn't ask me. I figured you'd be okay with it. I mean, it's for your protection. Your protection. As if I were some helpless old man who couldn't be trusted with his own security. As if this house, this life, wasn't mine to manage. What about my key? I'll get you a new one. These are better locks, Dad. Digital. I can program them remotely if you get locked out. If I get locked out of my own house. The words sat between us like a challenge neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I said nothing. Just watched him finish the job with the kind of precision that told me he'd thought this through. When he was done, he stood and brushed metal shavings from his pants. There, all set. He pulled out a small plastic card. This is your new key card. Just hold it up to the reader. I took the card. It was warm from his pocket, smooth and anonymous. Nothing like the brass key Margaret and I had shared for 3 decades, the one with the tiny scratch from the time she'd accidentally dragged it across the garage door. What happened to being able to just turn a key? This is better, Dad. More secure. And if something happens to you, I can... If something happens to me, what? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not malice, exactly. More like calculation. I can take care of things, handle the house until... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the porch Margaret had always said was too small but perfect anyway. In the distance, I could hear Madison's voice through the open car window, talking to her parents in that pitched tone people use when they're discussing arrangements. Well, I said, testing the weight of the plastic card in my palm. I suppose I should go inside and rest. Good idea. It's been a long day. I held the card up to the reader. There was a soft beep, a green light, and the lock disengaged. I turned the handle and stepped into my house. Behind me, I heard Ethan gathering his tools. The drill went into its case with a final, decisive click. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the sound of that drill, the efficiency of Ethan's movements, the way he'd had all the right equipment with him, as if he'd been planning this for longer than the 3 hours since we'd buried his mother. I got up around midnight and walked through the house, touching things. The mantel where Margaret had arranged our wedding photos. The bookshelf where she'd organized her gardening guides and mystery novels by author. The kitchen table where we'd eaten breakfast together, nearly every morning for 32 years. Everything was exactly where it should be, but somehow it all felt borrowed now, as if I were a guest in a museum of my own life. In my study, I found the bottle of Macallan 18 that Margaret had given me for my 60th birthday. I'd been saving it for a special occasion that never came. Now, looking at it in the lamplight, I realized there would be no more special occasions, just ordinary days stretching ahead, measured out in doctor's appointments and grocery runs and the slow accumulation of dust on photographs. I poured myself 2 fingers and sat in my leather chair, the one Margaret used to complain about because it didn't match anything else in the room. Through the window, I could see the street where Ethan had learned to ride his bicycle, where Margaret and I had taken our evening walks, where we'd planned to grow old together, watching the neighborhood change around us. The whiskey burned, but it was a clean burn, honest. I was halfway through the glass when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Footsteps on the porch, the soft beep of the electronic lock. Someone was using their card to get into my house. The front door opened, closed. Footsteps in the hallway, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged here. "Dad?" Ethan's voice, low and careful. "You awake?" I didn't answer, just sat in my chair, whiskey in hand, listening to my son move through my house like he owned it. He found me in the study, standing in the doorway with his keycard still in his hand. "Couldn't sleep either?" "Something like that." He looked at the whiskey bottle, at the glass in my hand. "Mom wouldn't have wanted you drinking alone. Your mother wanted a lot of things." There was a pause, the kind that fills up with everything you are not saying. "Dad, we need to talk about the future, about what makes sense." I took another sip of whiskey. "It's after midnight, Ethan." "I know, but Madison and we've been thinking. This house is too big for you now. Too much maintenance. Too many memories. Too many memories. As if memories were a burden rather than the only things worth keeping. And we think it might be time to consider options. Options. The kind of word that sounds reasonable until you realize it's not really a choice at all. What kind of options? He stepped into the room, sitting on the edge of Margaret's old sewing chair. "Well, there are some really nice senior communities, active living, people your age, activities. People my age, as if I'd somehow become ancient between the church and the cemetery." "I see." "And Madison's parents, they're looking for a place. Gerald's retiring next year, and they've always loved this neighborhood." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. I understood now why he'd changed the locks, why he'd had his keycard ready, why Madison's parents had been whispering in the car. This wasn't about my security. This was about succession planning. You want to sell my house. Not sell exactly, more like transition it, keep it in the family. The family. Madison's parents would take good care of it, and you'd be more comfortable somewhere designed for your needs, my needs. At 71, apparently my needs had become simple enough to be determined by others. I finished my whiskey and set the glass down on the table next to Margaret's photo. In the picture, she was laughing at something I'd said just before I snapped it. Her eyes were bright, her hair catching the summer light. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. "I'll think about it," I said. Ethan relaxed slightly. "Good, that's all we're asking. Just think about what makes the most sense." What makes the most sense? Another phrase that sounds reasonable until you realize whose sense they're talking about. He stood to leave, then paused. "Dad, the locks. They're really just about keeping you safe." I looked at him, standing in my study, holding his key card, talking about my safety while planning to relocate me like a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room. "I know exactly what they're about," I said. After he left, I sat in the dark for a long time. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds Margaret and I had learned to sleep through over 3 decades. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the occasional car passing under the streetlights we'd watched the city install 15 years ago. I thought about the drill, the efficiency, the way Ethan had answered every objection before I could make it, and I realized that while I'd been burying my wife, my son had been burying me. The difference was, I was still breathing. That had to count for something. As the first light began to filter through the kitchen blinds, I made coffee in the pot Margaret had used every morning for 20 years. The ritual felt sacred somehow, a small rebellion against the efficiency of change. While it brewed, I walked through each room slowly, taking inventory. This was still my house, my name on the deed, my signature on 30 years of mortgage payments, my sweat in the floorboards I'd refinished, the walls I'd painted, the pipes I'd replaced when the original ones finally gave up during that brutal winter of '98. But possession, I was beginning to understand, isn't just about legal documents. It's about who feels entitled to walk through your door with their own key. Who makes plans for your future without asking. Who changes your locks and calls it protection. By the time the coffee was ready, I'd made a decision. Not the one Ethan expected. Not the one that would make the most sense to Madison and her parents. I was going to find out exactly what I still owned, and more importantly, what I was willing to fight for. The war for my house was about to begin, and I had every intention of winning it. The next morning came too soon, and not soon enough. I had dozed fitfully in my chair, waking every hour to the sound of settling wood that no longer felt like home. By 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, but even that sounded different now. Margaret had always been the first one up, padding around in her worn slippers, humming softly while she prepared our morning ritual. Now the kitchen felt like a stage set for a play that had closed permanently. I was halfway through my first cup when I heard the soft beep of the front door. Footsteps in the hallway. No knock, no call of greeting. Just the confident entrance of someone who belonged here. "Morning, Dad." Ethan appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day in khakis and a polo shirt. Behind him, Madison emerged from what had been our guest room, wearing one of those casual outfits that cost more than my monthly utilities. "You stayed the night?" "We thought it would be good," Madison said, smoothing her hair. "You know, make sure you were okay after yesterday." After yesterday. As if burying my wife of 32 years was just another item to check off a list. "I'm fine." "Of course you are." Ethan moved to the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup like he'd done it 1,000 times. Maybe he had, back when this was still his childhood home instead of his inheritance. "But Madison and I were talking, and we think it might be good for you to get away for a few days. Clear your head." "Away where?" "The lake house. You always loved it up there. The lake house." Margaret and I had bought the little cabin on Clear Lake 15 years ago, back when we thought retirement would mean long weekends by the water, morning coffee on the dock, evenings watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that changed too fast to photograph. We'd planned to spend more time there once I turned 75, once the business practically ran itself, once we had all the time in the world. "It's beautiful this time of year," Madison added, her voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they're selling you something. All those fall colors. Very peaceful. Peaceful, another word that sounded caring, until you realized it was just another way of saying isolated. "I suppose I could go up for a day or two." "Great!" Ethan's enthusiasm felt rehearsed. "Take as long as you need. Really, just relax." An hour later, I was packing a small duffel bag while Ethan loaded what he called supplies into the back of his SUV. "Groceries," he said. "Firewood. Things to make me comfortable." I noticed he had already thought to grab my medication from the bathroom cabinet, my reading glasses from the nightstand, my favorite coffee mug from the kitchen. It was all very thoughtful, very thorough, very much like someone who had been planning this for longer than a morning conversation. The drive to Clear Lake took 90 minutes through country that was just beginning to turn. The maples were still mostly green, but you could see the promise of red at the edges of the leaves. Margaret had always loved this drive, especially in October. She'd make me pull over at the same roadside stand every year to buy apple cider and pumpkins we'd never carve, but couldn't resist buying anyway. "Remember when we used to come up here with you?" Ethan asked as we turned onto the lake road. I must have been, 8 or 9? You were 10. First time. You caught that bass off the dock. Right, that old bass. Mom was so proud. Was. Past tense. As if Margaret's pride was something that had died with her, instead of something that lived on in the memory of a boy who'd whooped with joy, while his mother clapped her hands and called him her little fisherman. The lake house sat on a rise overlooking the water, a modest 2-bedroom place with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light just right. Margaret had chosen it, of course. She'd walked through the 3 different properties before finding this one, but the moment she stepped onto that porch and saw the view, I knew we were done looking. It's just like I remembered, Ethan said as we pulled into the gravel driveway, except it wasn't. There were new chairs on the porch. Not the weathered Adirondack chairs Margaret and I had bought at a garage sale and painted lake blue one summer afternoon. These were different, newer, more expensive, the kind of furniture people bought when they were serious about using a place regularly. Did you buy new chairs? Madison's parents were here last month. They mentioned the old ones were getting pretty rickety. Madison's parents, Gerald and Patricia Monroe. I'd met them exactly 3 times, at the engagement party, the wedding, and Margaret's funeral. Nice enough people, I supposed, though Patricia had that particular way of looking at things that suggested she was always calculating improvements. They were here last month, just for a weekend. I hope that's okay. They love the lake, and since you and Mom weren't using it much, because Margaret had been in and out of hospitals for 6 months, and I'd been with her every step of the way. Because when your wife is dying, weekend getaways lose their appeal. I shouldered my duffel bag and followed Ethan up the porch steps. The new chairs were comfortable, I'd give them that. Cushioned seats, built-in cup holders, the kind of thoughtful features that spoke of money and planning. Inside, the changes were more subtle, but just as deliberate. The throw pillows Margaret had sewn were gone, replaced by store-bought ones in colors that coordinated better with the curtains. The fishing magazines I'd left scattered on the coffee table had been stacked neatly in a basket. The kitchen had been cleaned and reorganized, our mismatched dishes replaced by a matching set that looked like it had never been used. Madison helped me spruce things up a bit, Ethan said, watching me take inventory, just to make it more comfortable. Comfortable for whom, I wondered, but didn't ask. Don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying the story so far, and let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen next. He helped me carry my things to the master bedroom, the one where Margaret and I had spent our anniversary weekends and long summer vacations. Even here, the changes were evident. New bedding, new lamps, a frame print on the wall where our family photos used to hang. Where are the pictures? Oh, those old things. I put them away for safekeeping. Some of them were getting pretty faded. Faded, like memories that had outlived their usefulness. Well, Ethan said, checking his watch, I should probably head back. Madison's meeting with a realtor this afternoon. A realtor? For her parents. They're looking at a few places in our neighborhood. You know how it is. They want to be closer to Madison now that they're getting older. Closer to Madison, or closer to something else entirely. I walked him to the door, watched him load his tools back into the SUV, the same tools he'd used to change my locks. As he started the engine, he rolled down his window. Take your time up here, Dad. Really. Stay as long as you want. How long do you think that should be? He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. However long it takes. The SUV pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires. I stood on the porch until the sound faded completely, until I was alone with the lake and the afternoon wind and the growing certainty that I'd just been expertly managed. Inside, I opened my duffel bag and found everything I needed for a comfortable stay. Except the things that mattered most were missing. My reading glasses weren't the ones from my nightstand. They were an older pair from the kitchen drawer. The medication bottles were the right ones, but they'd been opened and sorted into a weekly pill organizer I'd never owned. Even my favorite coffee mug had been replaced with a similar but not identical one. Someone had gone through my things. Someone had decided what I needed and what I didn't. Someone had packed my bag like I was going to summer camp instead of taking a voluntary retreat to my own property. I walked through the house room by room, cataloging the changes. In the study, our old photo albums had been replaced with a few generic landscape prints. In the kitchen, the refrigerator that had been covered with grandchildren's drawings and appointment reminders and Margaret's shopping lists was now bare except for a single magnet holding a note in Ethan's handwriting. House phone disconnected. Use your cell if you need anything. E. The house phone. The landline Margaret and I had installed when we bought the place. The one she'd used to call me from the dock when dinner was ready. The one that connected us to the outside world when cell service got spotty during storms. Gone. I found it in the utility room, unplugged and wrapped us in a plastic bag like evidence from a crime scene. That evening, I sat on the porch in one of the new chairs, watching the sun set over water that looked the same as it always had. The lake didn't care about new furniture, or missing photographs, or disconnected phones. It just held the light until darkness came, then reflected the stars like it had for thousands of years before I was born, and would for thousands more after I was gone. But even the lake felt different now. Borrowed, temporary, like everything else in my suddenly uncertain life. I was reaching for my cell phone to call someone, anyone, when I realized I didn't know who to call. Margaret was gone. My few remaining friends were scattered across the country, living their own abbreviated lives. My lawyer was retired. My doctor wouldn't understand why I felt like a refugee in my own vacation home. The phone rang before I could decide. Ethan's number. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in. How's the lake?" "Quiet." "Good. That's what you need. Listen, I wanted to let you know, Madison and I stopped by the house earlier, just to pick up a few things. From the house I'd been encouraged to leave, using the key cards they had programmed without asking. "What things?" "Just some of Mom's clothes, for donation, and a few boxes from the garage, old business files you probably don't need anymore." Business files. 25 years of building a construction company from nothing. Contracts, blueprints, correspondence with clients who'd trusted me to build their dreams from the ground up. Those files are important. Were important, Dad. Past tense. The business is closed. You're retired. What do you need with old receipts and blueprints? What did I need with the documented proof of my professional life? With the evidence that I had once been a man who built things that lasted? I'd like them back. Dad, be reasonable. You can't hold on to everything forever. Sometimes you have to let go. Let go. The phrase everyone uses when they want you to surrender something they can't take by force. Where did you put them? Storage unit. Climate controlled. Very safe. I'll give you the address if you really want it, but honestly, when's the last time you looked at any of that stuff? When was the last time I had looked at the evidence of my own competence? When had I last needed proof that I was more than an inconvenient elderly man who required management? Ethan. Yeah, Dad? This isn't your house anymore. The silence stretched across the miles between us, across the years that had somehow transformed my son from the boy who'd helped me build a treehouse into the man who was systematically dismantling my life. What do you mean? I mean this lake house. It's not yours. It's mine. Margaret's and mine. Of course it is. I never said, you changed the furniture. You disconnected the phone. You packed my bag like I'm going to summer camp. Dad, we were just trying to... I know exactly what you were trying to do. Another silence, longer this time. Dad, I think you're upset about Mom. I think you're not thinking clearly. Not thinking clearly. The phrase every family uses when the inconvenient person starts noticing the convenient arrangements being made around them. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. Look, why don't you stay up there for a few more days? Get some rest. We can talk about all this when you get back. When I get back. To the house with new locks and missing photographs and sons who made plans without asking permission. Maybe I will. Good, that's good. Take care of yourself, Dad. He hung up before I could respond. I set the phone on the little table beside my new chair and listened to the night sounds of the lake, loons calling across the water, the soft lap of waves against the dock, the whisper of wind through pine trees that had been here long before any of us arrived and would remain long after we were gone. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt something other than grief. I felt anger. Clean, useful, clarifying anger. And with it came the beginning of a plan. Tomorrow, I would start making some calls. Not to Ethan, not to Madison or her parents, or anyone else who thought they knew what was best for me. I would call people who remembered when I was a man who built things, who solved problems, who didn't require management or improvement or gentle relocation to facilities designed for my diminished needs. It was time to find out what I still owned, and more importantly, what I was willing to fight for. The war for my life was about to begin in earnest, and I had no intention of losing. I woke before dawn to the sound of rain against the cabin windows, the kind of steady October downpour that turns leaves into slippery reminders of time passing. The lake was gray as gunmetal, its surface broken by raindrops that disappeared as quickly as they formed. In the kitchen, I made coffee with grounds Ethan had thoughtfully provided. A blend I didn't recognize, milder than what Margaret and I had always preferred. Even my morning ritual had been curated for me, adjusted to someone else's idea of what an elderly man should drink. I found myself standing at the window, mug in hand, staring at the empty dock where Margaret and I used to sit with our breakfast, planning our days around nothing more urgent than whether to fish or read or simply watch the water change color with the light. She'd always brought her mystery novels out there, while I'd scan the business section of papers from 3 counties away, both of us comfortable in the kind of silence that comes from 32 years of shared mornings. Now the dock looked abandoned. The Adirondack chairs we'd painted blue stored God knows where, replaced by a porch swing I'd never seen before. Even here, in what I'd foolishly thought was our refuge, someone had been making improvements. The house felt smaller without Margaret's presence, not because she'd taken up much physical space. She'd been a small woman, barely 5'3", even in her gardening boots, but because her energy had filled rooms in ways I was only beginning to understand. She'd been the one who'd insisted on buying local artwork for the walls, who'd sewn cushions for the window seats, who'd planted the herb garden outside the kitchen door so we could have fresh basil and oregano for the simple meals we cooked together. All of that was gone now, or stored away for safekeeping, or deemed too faded to preserve. In its place was a generic comfort that could have belonged to anyone or no one. I spent the morning walking through the house like a detective at a crime scene, cataloging what remained and what had vanished. In the bedroom closet, I found one of Margaret's old sweaters pushed to the back, a cream-colored cardigan with pearl buttons that she'd worn on cool evenings when we'd sit on the porch listening to the loons. I held it to my face and breathed in the faint scent of her lavender soap, a ghost of fragrance that made my chest tight. Why had they left this one thing? Had it been overlooked in the systematic removal of Margaret's presence? Or had someone made a conscious decision that I was allowed this one small comfort? In the study, I found something else they'd missed, a photograph tucked behind a row of books, one of those candid shots you take without thinking that somehow captures everything important. Margaret was in the garden, dirt on her knees, her hair escaping from an old straw hat, laughing at something I'd said while she planted marigolds around the base of our mailbox. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. I set the photograph on the desk where I could see it while I worked, then opened the laptop Ethan had thoughtfully provided. It wasn't my computer, that was apparently part of the old business files deemed unnecessary, but a newer model with a sticky note attached. Password is Mom's birthday. Use this for email and whatever else you need. E. Mom's birthday. As if Margaret had become a password instead of a person, a convenient way to secure access to whatever portion of digital life I was allowed to maintain. The email account was new too, forwarded from my old business address but stripped of its history. 25 years of correspondence with clients, suppliers, and subcontractors, gone, replaced with a clean slate that began the day after Margaret's funeral. I spent the afternoon learning to navigate this curated version of my own digital existence, and what I discovered made me understand just how thorough Ethan's planning had been. My bank statements had been simplified, the business accounts closed, the balances transferred to a single checking account, with Ethan listed as a secondary signer for emergencies. My insurance policies had been updated, beneficiaries changed, coverage adjusted to reflect my new status as a widower who no longer owned a business. Every financial thread that had once tied me to my former life had been carefully rewoven into a pattern I didn't recognize. But they'd made one mistake. In their eagerness to simplify my life, they'd overlooked something important. The lake house had its own account, a small credit union checking account Margaret and I had opened years ago specifically for cabin expenses. Not much money, a few $1,000s for repairs and utilities and the occasional weekend getaway splurge, but it was mine alone, in my name only, untouched by Ethan's helpful reorganization. More importantly, it was connected to the original deed, the title documents, the property records that proved this place belonged to me, regardless of who had rearranged the furniture. I made my first call to Harold Steinberg, my lawyer for 15 years until his retirement 2 years ago. His wife answered, her voice warm with recognition. "Frank, how good to hear from you. Harold's been wondering how you're holding up since since everything. I'm managing Ruth. Is Harold available? I need some advice." Harold came on the line with the gruff efficiency I remembered from countless business deals. "Frank, what's going on? Ruth said you sounded worried." I told him everything. The locks, the reorganized finances, the systematic removal of Margaret's presence from both houses, the way I had been encouraged to take a break while decisions were made about my future. Harold listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do when they're calculating the legal implications of each detail. "Jesus, Frank, how long has this been going on? Started the day we buried Margaret, maybe before. And you're calling me from the lake house? Where Ethan suggested I come to clear my head, while he and his wife make themselves comfortable in your house? That's about the size of it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next." Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Frank, I'm going to be straight with you. What you're describing sounds like the beginning of a competency challenge. They're building a case that you can't manage your own affairs." A competency challenge. Adult children go to court, claim their parent is no longer capable of making sound decisions. Usually it's about money. They want control of assets, power of attorney, the ability to make medical and financial decisions. But sometimes what? Sometimes it's about real estate, prime property that's being wasted on an old man who doesn't appreciate its value. The words hit me like cold water. They want the house. Both houses, I'd guess. And they're being smart about it, isolating you, removing your support systems, creating a paper trail that shows them taking care of your affairs because you're no longer capable. What do I do? First, document everything. Every conversation, every change they have made without permission, every time they've acted on your behalf without asking. Second, don't sign anything. No matter how reasonable it sounds, no matter how much they pressure you, don't put your name on any document they present. And third, you need to decide how hard you want to fight, because if they're serious about this, it's going to get ugly. Family court always does. That evening, I sat on the porch with Margaret's cardigan draped over my shoulders, watching the rain continue its steady assault on the lake. The water had turned nearly black, reflecting nothing, giving back only darkness. I thought about the boy Ethan had been, the one who would help me build a dock extension the summer he turned 16. We'd worked side by side for 3 days, him learning to measure twice and cut once, me teaching him the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. When we finished, Margaret had brought us lemonade and pronounced it the finest dock on the entire lake. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw opportunity in his mother's grave and his father's grief. When had that transformation happened? Had there been signs I'd missed? Moments when I should have recognized that my son was becoming someone I didn't know? Or maybe I'd always known, and just chosen not to see. The rain stopped sometime after midnight, leaving behind the kind of silence that feels deeper than ordinary quiet. I made myself a sandwich from the groceries Ethan had provided, turkey and Swiss, on bread that tasted like nothing, and ate standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dock that no longer felt like mine. Tomorrow, I would start making the calls Harold had suggested. I would begin documenting the systematic dismantling of my life, gathering evidence for a fight I'd never wanted to have. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve not just for Margaret, but for the son I'd thought I had, and the future I'd imagined for our family after she was gone. Outside, the lake began to catch the first reflection of starlight, tiny points of brightness scattered across the dark water, like promises someone had forgotten to keep. I pulled Margaret's sweater closer around my shoulders and began to plan my war. By morning, the lake had returned to its mirror calm, reflecting a sky so blue it looked like a promise. I woke with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes after a night of hard thinking, when your subconscious has been working on problems while your conscious mind rested. I had been approaching this all wrong. Instead of reacting to what Ethan and Madison were doing, I needed to act first. Instead of defending what remained of my territory, I needed to reclaim what had been taken. Most importantly, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting for. I spent the day going through the desk in the study, finding documents Ethan's efficiency hadn't quite reached. Property deeds, insurance papers, the original mortgage documents from when Margaret and I had bought this place. Legal proof that whatever else had been rearranged, this lake house was indisputably mine. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old towel, I found something else. Margaret's jewelry box, the small wooden one I'd given her for our first anniversary. Inside were her rings, her pearl necklace, the simple gold bracelet she'd worn every day for 20 years. Things too valuable to store away, too personal to reorganize. Things they'd forgotten existed. At the very bottom of the box, I found an envelope with my name written in Margaret's careful script. Inside was a letter dated 3 weeks before she died, when she was still lucid, but knew she was losing her battle. "My dear Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're alone, and I'm worried about what that means for you. Not because you can't take care of yourself, you're the strongest man I've ever known, but because I won't be there to remind you of it when other people forget." She'd known. Somehow she'd seen what was coming before I had. "Don't let them make you small, Frank. Don't let them convince you that being alone means being helpless. You built a business from nothing. You raised a son. You loved me through 32 years of marriage, sickness, and health, just like you promised. You are not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed." The letter continued for 3 pages, reminding me of my strengths, my accomplishments, my value as a human being who deserved respect rather than management. She ended with a simple instruction. "Fight for what matters, my love. I won't be there to fight with you, but I'll be watching. Make me proud." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my wallet, next to the photograph of us from our last anniversary dinner. Then I picked up the phone and called Harold again. "I want to fight," I said when he answered. "Whatever it takes, however hard it gets, I want to fight." "Good," he said, "because I've been making some calls of my own, and Frank, you're going to need every bit of fight you can find." The war for my life was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt like the man she'd married instead of the victim I'd been allowed to become. It was time to remind my son exactly who he was dealing with. 3 days after Harold's warning, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. Ethan's voice carried that forced cheerfulness people use when they're delivering rehearsed lines. "Dad, how are you feeling? Getting some good rest up there?" "I'm fine." "Good, good. Listen, Madison and I were thinking, maybe it's time you came back. We'd love to have you over for dinner tonight. Just family, like old times." Like old times. When exactly had those times included me being exiled to the lake house while they reorganized my life? What's the occasion? No occasion, just we miss you. And we have some things we'd like to discuss. Nothing major, just some ideas that might make things easier for everyone. Ideas that might make things easier. I was learning to translate Ethan's language, the way he wrapped demands and suggestions and ultimatums in concern. What kind of ideas? Well, we can talk about it tonight. Say, 6 o'clock, Madison's making that pot roast you love. The pot roast I love. Margaret had made pot roast every Sunday for 30 years, a recipe she'd learned from her mother, with carrots that dissolved into sweetness and gravy rich enough to stand a spoon in. I doubted Madison had that recipe, or the patience to cook something for 6 hours when you could buy a perfectly adequate substitute at the grocery store. "I'll be there." "Great." "Oh, and Dad? You might want to dress nice. We're having a few other people over. Madison's parents, maybe 1 or 2 others, just to make it special. Other people. A performance then, with an audience to witness my cooperation or my unreasonableness, depending on how the evening played out." I hung up and looked around the cabin that had become my temporary home. Someone, probably the same someone who'd replaced my coffee and disconnected my phone, had been here again while I was out walking the previous morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would hold up in court, but small changes that spoke of ongoing surveillance. The books on the shelf rearranged by height instead of by subject. The dish towels folded differently, the subtle reorganization that said, "We can reach you anywhere." But they'd missed Margaret's letter in my wallet, and they'd missed the business account information I'd found in the back of the filing cabinet. Most importantly, they'd missed the growing certainty in my mind that this dinner invitation wasn't about family reconciliation. It was about signing something. I drove back to town that afternoon, through country roads that looked like a postcard, advertising the perfect New England autumn. The maples were in full flame now, red and gold and orange in combinations that made you believe in beauty even when everything else in your life was turning dark. Margaret had always said October was God's way of reminding us that endings could be beautiful too. I parked in the driveway of the house I'd lived in for 32 years, behind a silver Mercedes I didn't recognize. The lawn had been professionally maintained in my absence. The flower beds Margaret had tended replaced with something more formal, more expensive, less personal. Even the mailbox had been upgraded, my name still on it, but in a font that suggested I was a tenant rather than the owner. Gerald Monroe answered the door before I could knock, as if he had been watching for me from the window. He wore a cardigan and slacks that screamed casual wealth, the kind of outfit people put on when they want to look approachable but still superior. "Frank, so good to see you looking well. The lake air must agree with you." Behind him, the house hummed with conversation and the clink of good crystal. Through the archway, I could see Madison setting the dining room table with china I didn't recognize, while Patricia arranged flowers in a vase that had never belonged to Margaret and me. "Where's Ethan?" "In the study, making some calls. Business, you know how it is." Gerald's laugh was hearty and empty. Come in, come in. Patricia's been looking forward to seeing you." I followed him into what had been my living room, and was now something else entirely. The furniture was mostly the same, but arranged differently, more formally. Margaret's Afghans had been replaced with decorator pillows. Her collection of mystery novels was gone from the shelves, replaced with coffee table books about architecture and travel destinations we'd never visit. "Frank, dear." Patricia appeared at my elbow with a glass of wine I hadn't asked for. "You look wonderful. Rested. The lake house is such a treasure, isn't it?" "It is." Gerald and I were just saying how perfect it would be for a couple looking to downsize. All that peaceful water, no lawn to maintain, just the sound of nature. So restorative. So restorative. And so conveniently located away from the house they had redesigned in my absence. Madison emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron over a dress that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past 2 years. She kissed my cheek with the kind of affection that felt like a performance for the other adults in the room. "Dad, Frank, I'm so glad you're here. Dinner's almost ready. How do you like what we've done with the place?" What they'd done with the place, my place, the home Margaret and I had built together, now redecorated to suit strangers' tastes. It's different. Better, I think. More modern. Mom always said you needed someone with a woman's touch to bring out the best in a space. Mom. As if Margaret had been Madison's mother instead of her mother-in-law. As if 3 years of marriage had given Madison inheritance rights to Margaret's opinions as well as her house. Did she? It wasn't a question, and Madison's smile flickered for just a moment before reassembling itself. Ethan appeared from the study, phone still in hand, wearing the kind of satisfied expression that meant whatever business he'd been conducting had gone well. He clapped me on the shoulder with manufactured enthusiasm. "Dad, perfect timing. I just got off a call with some very interesting people." "What kind of people?" "We'll get to that. First, let's eat. I'm starving." The dining room table had been set for 6 with china and silver I'd never seen before. Margaret's everyday dishes, the ones with tiny blue flowers that she'd collected piece by piece from garage sales and antique shops, were nowhere in sight. In their place was a formal service that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about entertaining and good taste. The pot roast, when it appeared, was perfectly adequate. Store-bought quality, heated and served with vegetables that looked like they had been arranged by someone who'd read about cooking in a book. Nothing like the Sunday roasts Margaret had made with love and time and the accumulated wisdom of 40 years in the kitchen. "This is delicious," I said, because politeness was a weapon I could still wield. "Madison's been taking cooking classes," Patricia announced proudly. "She's become quite the chef." The conversation flowed around topics that had nothing to do with me. Madison's volunteer work at the country club, Gerald's golf handicap, Patricia's book club selection for next month. I ate and listened and watched, feeling like a guest at someone else's family dinner. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen automatically, the way people do when they're not really engaged in the conversation around them. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. "Don't drink the wine. Leave now. Trust me." My hand froze with the wine glass halfway to my lips. I looked around the table, but everyone else was engaged in animated discussion about the proposed new golf course across town. No one was watching me. No one seemed to have noticed my reaction. Another buzz, another message. "Check your glass. Look at the bottom." I tilted the glass slightly, catching the light from the chandelier Margaret and I had bought for our 10th anniversary. There, barely visible, was a thin film of something that shouldn't have been in a proper glass of Cabernet. Not much, just enough to suggest that someone had rinsed the glass with something other than water. My chest went cold. I set the glass down carefully and reached for my water instead, my mind racing through possibilities. Sleeping pills? Something stronger? Something designed to make me compliant, agreeable, ready to sign whatever documents Ethan had prepared? If you're enjoying this story and want to see how it ends, please like this video and share it with someone who loves family drama. Your support means everything to independent storytellers like me. Dad, you're not drinking your wine. Ethan's voice cut through my thoughts. It's a good vintage. I picked it out specially for tonight. Just pacing myself. Of course, smart man. Speaking of smart decisions, I wanted to talk to you about that call I was on earlier. Here it comes, I thought. The reason for the dinner, the audience, the carefully staged reconciliation. There's a gentleman who's been looking at properties in this area. High-end developments, retirement communities, that sort of thing. He's very interested in our neighborhood, particularly houses with the kind of character and lot size that this place offers. Is he? Very interested. Enough that he's made what I'd call a generous preliminary offer, sight unseen, based just on the property records and some photos Madison took. While I was conveniently absent at the lake house, grieving my wife and learning to navigate my reorganized life. How generous? Gerald leaned forward, his businessman's instincts engaged. Frank, I've been in real estate for 30 years. This is the kind of offer that comes along once in a lifetime. Enough to set you up comfortably for whatever time you have left, in a place designed specifically for your needs. Whatever time I have left. The phrase hung in the air like a diagnosis. What place? Sunset Manor, Patricia said warmly. It's lovely, Frank. Gardens, activities, people your own age, and so convenient for family visits. Sunset Manor. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to the hardware store. A sprawling complex of identical units designed to house people whose families had decided they needed managing. Have you seen the brochures? Madison was already reaching for a folder beside her plate. They have different levels of care, so you'd never have to worry about what happens if your health changes. If my health changes. Another gentle assumption that I was already declining, just hadn't admitted it yet. The brochures were glossy and professional, full of photographs of elderly people engaged in supervised activities, eating communal meals, participating in organized entertainment. Everyone looked clean and safe, and utterly bereft of personal history. The one-bedroom units are very nice, Patricia continued. Just the right size for a single person. No maintenance, no yard work, no worries about security or repairs. Everything taken care of. Everything taken care of. Including, presumably, the inconvenience of having to ask my permission for decisions about my own life. My phone buzzed again. Say you need to think about it. Don't sign anything tonight. They have papers ready. I looked up from the brochure to find 5 pairs of eyes watching me expectantly. Ethan had his phone out, probably ready to call someone. Gerald had a pen in his hand. Patricia was smiling with the kind of encouragement she'd probably use on a child learning to tie his shoes. It's a lot to consider, I said carefully. Of course it is, Ethan said. That's why we've prepared some preliminary paperwork. Nothing binding, just an expression of interest. Gets the process started so you have time to make a proper decision. Nothing binding, just like the locks had been for security and the financial reorganization had been for simplification. I'd like to think about it. Naturally. But Frank, Gerald's voice took on the tone of a man used to closing deals. Opportunities like this don't wait. The buyer is leaving for Europe next week. If we don't have something signed tonight... Tonight? Just preliminary papers, Madison repeated. Nothing you can't change your mind about later. But we all knew that once you started down this path, once you signed the first document that acknowledged you were considering giving up your life, it became exponentially harder to change course. My phone buzzed one more time. Leave, now, before they pressure you more. Someone is watching out for you. Someone was watching out for me. In this house full of people who claimed to love me while systematically dismantling my independence, someone was on my side. I stood up slowly, the way elderly men do when they want to look frail and harmless. I need some air, I said. This is a lot to process. Of course, Patricia said. Why don't you step out onto the porch? We'll clear the table and give you some space to think. Space to think. While they prepared documents and made phone calls and arranged my future according to their convenience. I walked out onto the porch that Margaret and I had rebuilt 3 summers ago, where we'd shared morning coffee and evening conversations and all the small intimacies of a long marriage. Even here, changes had been made. The swing where we used to sit was gone, replaced by individual chairs that didn't encourage lingering or conversation. My phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Dalton, this is Sarah Chen. I clean house for your son and his wife." The voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone who knew she was taking a risk by making this call. "You sent the messages." "Yes, sir. I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard them talking about the wine, about papers they want you to sign tonight, about how they need to get this done before you change your mind." "What did they put in the wine?" "I don't know exactly. Something Mrs. Madison got from her mother's medicine cabinet. She said it would just make you more agreeable to their suggestions." More agreeable. Drugged into compliance in my own dining room, surrounded by people who called themselves family while plotting to rob me of my choices. "Sarah, why are you helping me?" "Because you're a good man, Mr. Dalton. You always treated me with respect, asked about my children, paid me fairly, and because what they're doing isn't right. Nobody should have their life taken away piece by piece like this." Through the window, I could see them inside, heads bent together over documents spread across the table, where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 32 years. Ethan had his phone out again, probably calling lawyers or real estate agents or whatever other professionals were needed to finalize the transfer of my autonomy. "Sarah, I need to leave. Can you keep them busy for a few minutes?" "I'll find something that needs attention in the kitchen. Give you time to get to your car." I walked back inside with the slow, careful steps of a man who had made his decision. They all looked up expectantly as I entered the dining room. "Well?" Gerald asked. "Have you had time to think?" "I have." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my wallet, extracting the letter Margaret had written me. Her handwriting looked stark and honest under the dining room lights she'd chosen, in the room she had decorated, surrounded by people who'd erased every trace of her presence while I was grieving at the lake. "This is what my wife thought about people who try to make others small," I said, setting the letter on the table next to the unsigned documents. "I suggest you read it." Then I walked out of my own house for what I suspected would be the last time, leaving behind the sound of chairs scraping and voices raised in surprise, and the rustle of papers that would never bear my signature. In my car, I called Harold. "They tried to drug me," I said without preamble, "at dinner, in my own house, while they had papers ready for me to sign. Jesus Christ, Frank, are you okay?" "I'm okay, but Harold, I'm done playing defense. It's time to go on the attack." "What do you need?" I looked back at the house where lights were blazing now, where I could see figures moving urgently from room to room, probably searching for me or calling other people to report that their plan had failed. "I need to disappear for a while, and I need to make some moves they won't see coming." "How long do you need?" "Long enough to remind them that I'm not a problem to be solved. I'm a man who knows how to fight back." The war for my life had just escalated, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt like I was winning. The extended stay America off Route 9 wasn't the kind of place Margaret and I had ever imagined I'd be staying, but it had 2 things I needed: anonymity and Wi-Fi strong enough to conduct the kind of business that required privacy. I paid cash for a week, gave them a name that wasn't quite mine, and settled into a room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and other people's temporary lives. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort wasn't the point anymore. The point was having space to think without wondering who might be listening, who might be making notes about my mental state, who might be documenting my daily habits for future use in court proceedings. I spread Harold's business cards across the narrow desk and began making calls. The first was to Marcus Webb, a private investigator Harold had recommended. Marcus had the kind of voice that suggested he'd heard every family drama imaginable and wasn't easily shocked. "Mr. Dalton." Harold filled me in on the basics: financial manipulation, possible drugging attempt, systematic isolation. "You want to know what your son's really up to?" "I want to know everything. His finances, his marriage, his business dealings. Why he needs my house badly enough to risk poisoning me for it. That'll take time and money." "I have both." "Good, because if your son's as smart as he sounds, He's covered his tracks, but people always leave traces when they think no one's looking. The second call was to Janet Morrison at Clearwater Credit Union, where Margaret and I had opened the Lake House account years ago. Janet had known us since we were middle-aged and planning for a future that seemed limitless. Oh, Frank, I was so sorry to hear about Margaret. She was such a lovely woman. Thank you, Janet. I need to ask you about my account there, the cabin account. Of course, what can I help you with? I want to know if anyone else has tried to access it, made inquiries, requested information, attempted any kind of transaction. There was a pause, the sound of fingers on a keyboard. Well, that's interesting. Yes, actually, your son called 2 weeks ago asking about the balance and whether there were any liens or encumbrances on the associated property. 2 weeks ago. While I was sitting by Margaret's hospital bed, holding her hand as she slipped away from me, Ethan was calling banks to inventory my assets. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. Banking information is confidential. But, Frank, he seemed to know quite a bit about your account already, almost like he'd seen statements or had access to your records somehow. Someone had been going through my papers, probably while I was at the hospital, probably while I was focused on Margaret's final days instead of protecting my own interests. Janet, I need to make some changes to that account. Remove any emergency contacts, update the passwords, and set up new security protocols. I can help with that. Would you like to come in tomorrow? I'll be there. The third call was the hardest one. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had been Margaret's physician for 15 years and mine for the past 5, ever since my heart attack. She'd seen us through Margaret's cancer diagnosis, my cardiac recovery, and all the smaller indignities of growing older together. Frank, how are you holding up? I know how difficult this must be. I'm managing, Pat, but I need to ask you something sensitive. Has anyone called asking about my medical records? Specifically about my mental competency? Another pause, longer this time. Frank, I can't discuss other patients or their families, but I will say this. If someone were to challenge your mental capacity, they'd need current medical documentation. And based on our last visit, there's nothing in your chart that would support such a challenge. But if someone wanted to try, they'd probably start by questioning your ability to live independently. Your judgment about financial matters, your memory, your decision-making capacity, your general wellness. And if they had a friendly doctor willing to suggest I needed supervision, Frank, are you in some kind of trouble? I looked around the motel room with its beige walls and polyester bedspread, at the life I'd been reduced to in the space of a week. I'm in exactly the kind of trouble you'd expect from a man whose family thinks he's outlived his usefulness. That evening, I sat in the motel's lobby with a cup of coffee that tasted like burned rubber, and my laptop open to a legal document search website Harold had told me about. For $25, I could access property records, business filings, and court documents for anyone in the state. Ethan's financial life, it turned out, was more complicated than I'd imagined. The house he and Madison lived in, the one where they'd served me drugged wine on china I'd never seen, was mortgaged to the hilt. Not just a standard home loan, but a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit, and something called a private bridge loan that carried an interest rate that made my chest tight just reading it. His consulting business, the one he'd described as taking off and expanding rapidly, had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 6 months ago. The court documents made for grim reading: outstanding debts to vendors, unpaid taxes, a lawsuit from a former client alleging breach of contract and demanding damages that exceeded anything Ethan could pay. Most interesting was a filing from just 2 weeks ago, a request to convert the Chapter 11 to a Chapter 7, which meant liquidating everything and starting over from nothing. 2 weeks ago, the same time he'd been calling my bank, asking about my account balances. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about standing up for themselves. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we need to fight hardest. I printed everything and organized it in a folder that was growing thicker by the hour. Financial pressure, mounting debt, legal troubles that threatened to destroy not just Ethan's business, but his marriage, his lifestyle, his carefully constructed image of success. And across town, an elderly father with 2 valuable properties and no immediate family to protect his interests. The mathematics of desperation were becoming clear. I made one more call that night to a number I'd memorized years ago but never had reason to use. Frank Delacroix answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the same Louisiana drawl it had when we'd served together in the Guard 30 years ago. "Frank Dalton, you old bastard. I heard about Margaret. I'm sorry, buddy." "Thanks, Dell. Listen, I need a favor, the kind that requires discretion and possibly some skills you picked up in other lines of work." "What kind of skills?" "The kind that help a man protect what's his when his own family decides it belongs to them." Dell was quiet for a moment. "You in some kind of trouble, Frank?" "The worst kind. Family trouble. Say no more. Where do you need me?" I gave him the address of the lake house and told him to bring whatever equipment he thought might be useful for securing a property against unauthorized access. Dell had spent his post-military career in private security, the kind of work that taught you how to make buildings very uncomfortable for people who didn't belong there. "How soon?" "Tomorrow morning. And Dell, bring your sense of humor. We're going to give some people a lesson they won't forget." After I hung up, I sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the motel room and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's diagnosis. The satisfaction of making a plan instead of simply reacting to other people's plans for me. Ethan thought he was dealing with a confused old man whose grief had made him malleable. He thought he could isolate me, control my environment, and gradually assume authority over my decisions until I forgot I'd ever had choices of my own. He was about to learn otherwise. I opened Margaret's letter and read it again, her words steady and sure in the lamplight. "Fight for what matters, my love. I won't be there to fight with you, but I'll be watching. Make me proud." Tomorrow, I would start making her proud. Tonight, I would finish planning a war that my son didn't know he'd already lost. The phone rang just after midnight. Ethan's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message in the dark. "Dad, where are you? We're worried. You left without saying goodbye, and your car isn't at the lake house. Please call me back. We need to talk about what happened tonight, about those accusations you made. They're not fair, and they're not accurate, and we need to clear the air before this gets out of hand. Not fair, not accurate." As if my objection to being drugged was a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to attempted assault. I deleted the message and turned off the phone. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new attempts at reconciliation, new schemes to separate me from my property and my independence. But tonight, for the first time since Margaret died, I felt like the man she'd married instead of the victim I'd been encouraged to become. The war was just beginning, and I had every intention of finishing it on my own terms. Dell arrived at the lake house before I did, his pickup truck already parked in the driveway when I pulled up at 7 a.m. I found him on the dock, coffee steaming in a travel mug, studying the property with the methodical gaze of a man assessing defensive positions. "Nice place, he said without turning around. "Quiet. Good sight lines, only one road in or out. That used to be a selling point. Still is, depending on what you're selling." He faced me, and I saw the same sharp intelligence that had made him valuable in situations where thinking fast meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. "You want to tell me exactly what we're dealing with here?" I told him everything. The locks, the dinner, the drugged wine, the systematic erasure of Margaret's presence from both properties. Dell listened without interrupting, occasionally sipping his coffee, his expression growing colder with each detail. "So, they want you gone, but they want it to look like your idea. That's about the size of it. And they're using your grief as leverage, making you think you can't function without their help. While they steal everything that matters to me." Dell nodded slowly. "I've seen this before. Usually it's siblings fighting over an inheritance, but the playbook's the same. Isolate, confuse, control, then present the solution that benefits them most." He walked around the cabin's perimeter, testing windows, examining door frames, noting sight lines and potential security vulnerabilities. When he finished, he sat on the porch steps and pulled out a small notebook. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we make this place truly yours again. Change the locks, properly this time, with hardware they can't override remotely. Install a security system that only you control. Set up surveillance so you know who's coming and going." That sounds expensive. Less expensive than losing your house to people who think you're too old to fight back. The morning was spent transforming the cabin from a comfortable retreat into something resembling a secure facility. Dell worked with the efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of job before, installing deadbolts that required old-fashioned keys, motion sensors that would alert my phone to any approaching vehicles, and cameras that gave me complete coverage of the property from every angle. The beauty of modern technology, he said as he programmed the final settings, is that it can work for you instead of against you. Your son thinks tech makes you vulnerable. We're going to prove him wrong. By afternoon, I had complete control of the property for the first time since Margaret's death. More importantly, I had documentation of everyone who tried to access it without permission. The first test came sooner than expected. At 4 p.m., the motion sensors alerted me to a vehicle approaching. I checked the camera feed and saw Ethan's SUV, followed by a second car I didn't recognize. They parked in my driveway like they owned it, and I watched through the cameras as 5 people got out. Ethan, Madison, her parents, and a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. They approached the front door with the confidence of people who expected to be welcomed. Ethan reached for his key card, held it up to where the electronic reader used to be, and frowned when nothing happened. He tried again, still nothing. I let them knock for 2 full minutes before I opened the door, standing in the doorway without stepping back to let them enter. "Dad, what happened to the lock?" "I fixed it." "Fixed it how?" "The old-fashioned way, with a key that belongs to me." The man in the suit stepped forward, his smile professional and predatory. "Mr. Dalton, I'm James Whitmore from Whitmore and Associates. I understand you're considering some property transactions." "You understand wrong." His smile didn't waver. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. I have some proposals that I think you will find very attractive." "I'll find them more attractive when you discuss them from my driveway." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Dad, don't be difficult. James drove all the way up here to meet with you. James can drive all the way back. At least look at the numbers," Gerald interjected, pulling papers from his jacket pocket. "Frank, these offers are generous, more than generous. I'm not selling." "You haven't even heard the terms," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patient tone people use with stubborn children. "Sometimes we have to consider options we hadn't planned on. Sometimes we have to consider options. The royal we, as if my decisions were community property. The option I'm considering," I said, "is which one of you is going to be the first to leave my property." Madison stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears that looked rehearsed. "Dad, Frank, we're family. We're trying to help you. Can't you see that?" "I can see exactly what you're trying to do." The man in the suit, Whitmore, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Dalton, I have contracts here that would set you up for life. Guaranteed income, professional management of your assets, care coordination if your health declines. You'd never have to worry about money or maintenance or making difficult decisions again. Never have to worry about making difficult decisions again. The promise of a life without agency, without responsibility, without the burden of choice. Get off my property. Mr. Dalton, now." They left, but not quickly and not quietly. I watched through the cameras as they gathered at their cars, gesturing toward the house, their body language sharp with frustration and anger. Ethan made several phone calls, his free hand cutting through the air as he spoke. Whatever he was telling whoever was on the other end, he wasn't happy about the day's developments. That evening, I called Harold from the secure phone Dell had installed. "They brought a real estate lawyer to my door," I told him, "with contracts already drawn up. They're not planning anymore, Harold. They're executing." "What did the contracts say?" "I didn't read them. Sent them away before they could get their foot in the door." "Smart. But, Frank, this tells us they're working with professionals now. It's not just family pressure anymore. They've hired people who know how to make legal challenges stick." "What's my next move?" "We need to move faster than they do. I've been researching protective legal structures, and I think I have an option that would make it impossible for them to challenge your property ownership, even if they somehow manage to have you declared incompetent." "I'm listening." "An irrevocable trust. You transfer ownership of both properties to a trust that you control as trustee, but that can't be dissolved or modified without court approval. Even if they get guardianship, they can't touch trust assets." "What's the catch?" "The catch is that it's permanent. Once the properties go into the trust, they're protected, but they're also locked. You can't sell them without jumping through legal hoops that would take months. And if I die, the trust provisions take effect. You can name any beneficiary you want, or you can donate the properties to charity. Your choice, but not your son's choice." The idea had a certain appeal, not just the legal protection, but the poetic justice of it. Ethan wanted my property. He could watch it disappear into a structure he couldn't touch, couldn't manipulate, couldn't claim as his inheritance. How long would it take to set up? If we move fast, 3 days. I know a judge who understands family dynamics and doesn't like seeing elderly people pushed around. Do it. The next morning brought rain and a new development. I was making coffee when the cameras alerted me to movement near the house. Not vehicles this time, but people on foot, approaching through the woods from the direction of the main road. Through the monitor, I watched Ethan and Madison emerge from the tree line, followed by Gerald and a fourth person I didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s carrying what looked like a medical bag. They thought they could avoid the cameras by coming through the woods. They were wrong. I let them get all the way to the porch before I spoke through the intercom Dell had installed. The property is posted. You're trespassing. Ethan looked up at the camera, his face flushed from the hike through wet undergrowth. Dad, we need to talk. Dr. Morrison is here to do a wellness check. Dr. Morrison, not Dr. Hendricks, who'd been my physician for years and would have told them I was perfectly competent. Someone new, someone who had never met me before today, someone who might be more willing to find problems that existed primarily on paper. I didn't request a wellness check. Family members can request them, the woman said, looking directly into the camera. I'm Dr. Ellen Morrison from Clearwater Medical Associates. Your son is concerned about your recent behavior. The isolation, the suspicion, the refusal to accept help from people who care about you. Recent behavior. Living alone in my own property, refusing to be drugged, declining to sign papers that would transfer my assets to people who'd already started spending my money. My behavior is fine. That's what we'd like to determine. May we come in? If you're loving this story, please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. Stories like this take time to research and write, and your support helps me keep bringing you family drama that hits close to home. You may not. Madison stepped forward, her voice carrying the tremor of someone who'd practiced this speech. Dad Frank, we're worried about you. You disappeared from dinner without explanation. You've been hiding up here for days. You won't answer your phone or respond to messages. That's not normal behavior. Not normal behavior. Translation: behavior that interfered with their timeline. What's normal is a man grieving his wife without being pressured to sign away his life's work. No one's pressuring you, Gerald said reasonably. We're offering you options. Freedom from responsibility, professional care if you need it. I don't need it. Dr. Morrison opened her medical bag and pulled out a clipboard. Mr. Dalton, I understand this is difficult, but your family has reported some concerning symptoms. Memory problems, paranoid thinking, difficulty managing daily activities. A simple evaluation would put everyone's mind at ease. Concerning symptoms reported by people who'd drugged my wine and stolen my business files. People who'd changed my locks and reorganized my finances and made plans for my future without including me in the conversation. Dr. Morrison, are you familiar with my medical history? Your son provided some background. My son isn't my doctor. Dr. Patricia Hendricks is my physician, and she has complete medical records going back 5 years. If you're genuinely concerned about my health, you should consult with someone who actually knows me. Mr. Dalton, I understand your reluctance, but you understand nothing about my situation except what you've been told by people with financial motives for having me declared incompetent. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Through the camera, I could see Ethan's face go white, Madison's mouth open in shock. Gerald's businessman's mask slipped just enough to show the calculation underneath. That's a serious accusation, Dr. Morrison said. It's an accurate accusation, and it's documented. I held up the folder Marcus had prepared for me, thick with financial records and legal documents and photographs of signed contracts that told the story of my son's desperation. Dr. Morrison, unless you have a court order, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff. They left, but not without a lot of angry conversation I couldn't quite hear through the cameras. As their cars disappeared down the lake road, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Margaret got sick. The satisfaction of winning a battle I'd chosen to fight. But the war was far from over. That afternoon, Harold called with news that would change everything. The trust documents are ready, he said. I can have them filed tomorrow morning if you're ready to pull the trigger. What does that mean, exactly? It means that by tomorrow afternoon, you'll no longer own either property. The Frank Dalton Family Trust will own them, with you as the sole trustee. Your son can't challenge what you don't technically possess. And the beneficiaries? Your choice entirely. You can name anyone you want, or you can designate charitable organizations. The point is, it's your decision, not theirs. I thought about Margaret's letter, about her instruction to fight for what mattered. The properties themselves didn't matter. They were just wood and stone and glass. What mattered was the principle that a man should have the right to determine his own fate, to protect what he'd built, to choose how his story ended. Do it, I said. File the papers. Frank, you understand that once this is done, there's no going back? The trust is irrevocable. Even you can't dissolve it without court approval. Good. That means they can't either. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing. Not the secure phone Dell had installed, but my regular cell phone, the one Ethan could still reach. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice deliberately thick with sleep. Dad, thank God. We've been worried sick. Where are you staying? I'm fine, Ethan. Are you at the lake house? We stopped by yesterday, but you wouldn't let us in. Dr. Morrison was very concerned about your mental state. My mental state is excellent. Dad, you accused us of trying to steal from you. That's not rational thinking. We're your family. We love you. We'd never hurt you. The lies came so smoothly I almost admired the technique. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't seen the contracts and felt the effects of whatever they had put in my wine, I might have believed him. Ethan, I want you to listen very carefully. I'm listening. As of this morning, I no longer own either house. They have been transferred to a legal structure you can't touch, can't challenge, and can't inherit. Silence. Not the pause of someone processing information, but the dead air of someone whose world had just shifted fundamentally. What are you talking about? I'm talking about making sure that what's mine stays mine, regardless of what happens to me. Dad, you can't. I already have. The papers were filed an hour ago. Another silence, longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of concern. You've made a serious mistake. The only mistake I made was trusting family to act like family. This isn't over. Yes, I said quietly. It is. I hung up and turned off the phone. Through the window, the lake reflected the morning sky like polished steel, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to the small wars people fought over property and pride and the right to determine their own fate. Margaret's letter was in my wallet, her words a reminder that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. I'd fought this one and won. Now, all that remained was learning to live with the victory. The silence that followed was different from the enforced quiet of grief. This was the silence of a man who had made choices and could live with their consequences. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. And that feeling, I realized, was worth more than any property, any inheritance, any family relationship built on manipulation rather than love. The war was over. I had won it by refusing to fight on their terms. Now, it was time to build something new on the foundation they hadn't been able to touch. My own sense of who I was and what I deserved. The first letter arrived 3 days after I'd transferred the properties to the trust. Not delivered by the postal service, but slipped under the cabin door sometime during the night while I slept. I found it at dawn when I stepped onto the porch for my morning coffee. A plain white envelope with my name written in block letters designed to disguise the handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my blood run cold. Trusts can be challenged. Old men can have accidents. Think carefully about your choices. I photographed the letter before touching it further, then called Harold immediately. They're threatening me now? Directly? Anonymous note under my door mentions accidents and challenging the trust. Harold was quiet for a moment. Frank, I think it's time we brought law enforcement into this. What you're describing has moved beyond family pressure into criminal territory. Will they take it seriously? With the documentation we have, the drugged wine, the financial manipulation, now written threats? Yes, they'll take it seriously. That afternoon, I met with Sheriff Deputy Maria Santos at the cabin. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough family disputes to recognize the dangerous ones. She read the threatening letter, studied the photographs Dell had taken of the security system installation, and reviewed the timeline Harold had prepared documenting every instance of unauthorized access or manipulation. Mr. Dalton, this is harassment at minimum, possibly extortion. The threat of physical harm escalates it significantly. What can you do? Issue a formal warning first. Make it clear that any further contact constitutes stalking under state law. But I have to ask, are you prepared for this to get worse before it gets better? Worse how? People with this much financial pressure don't give up easily. And they're not likely to be deterred by a warning letter. She was right, of course. That evening, my new security system proved its worth when the cameras picked up movement around the property at 2 a.m. Not vehicles this time, but figures on foot, moving with the deliberate stealth of people who didn't want to be seen. I watched through the monitor as two men approached the cabin from different angles, one heading for the back door, the other circling toward the generator shed. They moved with professional efficiency, wearing dark clothing and carrying equipment I couldn't identify in the infrared footage. I called 911 first, then Dell. I've got intruders, 2 of them. They're not kids looking for trouble. Stay inside. Keep the cameras running. I'm 20 minutes out. The sheriff's deputy arrived first, lights flashing but sirens silent. By the time she reached the property, my uninvited visitors had vanished back into the woods, leaving behind only footprints in the soft earth around the cabin and scratches on the generator housing that suggested they'd been trying to disable my power supply. Professional job, Deputy Santos said, examining the marks with a flashlight. They knew what they were looking for. How do you disable someone's power without it looking deliberate? Make it look like equipment failure. Old generator gives out, happens all the time. Property owner gets stranded without electricity, no security system, no way to call for help. Perfect setup for an accident. The word accident hung in the air like smoke from a gun. We both knew what kind of accident an isolated elderly man might have in the dark, with no witnesses and no way to summon help. Dell arrived as the deputy was finishing her report, his truck loaded with equipment that definitely wasn't available at the local hardware store. Motion sensors around the perimeter, he said, unloading boxes. Night vision cameras, backup power supply, and a few surprises for anyone who thinks they can take a quiet walk on your property after dark. Please share this story if you know someone who's dealt with family betrayal. Sometimes people need to know they're not alone in fighting back against manipulation. The next morning brought a phone call from Marcus Webb, the private investigator. Frank, I've got some interesting information about your son's financial situation. It's worse than we thought. How much worse? He owes money to people who don't take late payments kindly, the kind of people who consider property acquisition a legitimate form of debt collection. You're saying he borrowed money from criminals? I'm saying he borrowed money from people who operate outside traditional banking regulations. And according to my sources, they've been asking questions about his collateral. What collateral? 2 residential properties, one in town, one on the lake, both supposedly owned by his elderly father who might be amenable to helping his son out of a difficult situation. The mathematics of desperation were becoming clearer. Ethan hadn't just wanted my property. He had already promised it to people who wouldn't accept excuses or delays. Marcus, how much time do I have? Hard to say. These people tend to be impatient, but they're also careful. They won't do anything that draws law enforcement attention unless they're convinced they can get away with it. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have horrified Margaret, but felt absolutely right in the circumstances. I called the sheriff's office and requested a meeting with someone who specialized in what they euphemistically called organized crime activities. Detective Ray Kowalski looked like he'd stepped out of a 1970s police parole role, complete with mustache and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variation of human greed and stupidity. We met at a diner in the next county, away from local ears and eyes. Mr. Dalton, Deputy Santos filled me in on your situation. She mentioned some concerns about the people your son might be involved with. What kind of people are we talking about? The kind who specialize in asset recovery through creative means. They loan money to people who can't get traditional financing, usually at rates that guarantee default. Then they collect through property acquisition, family pressure, or other forms of persuasion. Other forms. Let's just say they're not bound by banking regulations. I told him about the midnight visitors, the threats, the systematic campaign to gain control of my property. Kowalski listened with the patience of a man who'd heard similar stories before. Mr. Dalton, I'm going to be straight with you. If your son owes money to the people I think he owes money to, they're not going to be deterred by legal documents or security systems. They're going to keep escalating until they get what they want. Or until they can't. What do you mean? I pulled out the trust documents Harold had prepared, the papers that would transform my property from personal assets into protected legal entities. I mean, they can threaten me all they want. They can't steal what I don't own anymore. Kowalski studied the documents with professional interest. Irrevocable trust. Smart. Even if they somehow got to you, the property would be untouchable. That's the idea. But, Mr. Dalton, there's something you should understand. People like this don't just want your property. They want to send a message. If you make them look weak, if you cost them money they thought was guaranteed, they might decide that revenge is more important than recovery. The implication was clear. I could protect my property, but I couldn't necessarily protect myself. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you might want to consider making this problem go away permanently. How? By making sure the people pressuring your son understand that you're not as vulnerable as they think, and that continuing to target you would be more trouble than it's worth. He pulled out a business card, not his official police department, but something else, a private number. If you decide you want to send that message, call me. I know people who specialize in making problems like this disappear. That night, I sat on the cabin porch with Margaret's sweater around my shoulders, watching stars reflect in the still water of the lake. The security system hummed quietly around me, invisible but alert, ready to document any attempt at intrusion. I thought about the choice I was facing. I could finish what I'd started, transfer the properties into the trust, disappear into legal protection, and hope that would be enough to deter further harassment. Or I could take Detective Kowalski's advice and fight back with methods that went beyond legal documents and security cameras. The decision came to me as I watched a loon land on the water, its call echoing across the lake with wild, lonely beauty. Margaret had loved that sound, had said it reminded her that some things remained untamed, no matter how civilized the world pretended to be. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on Kowalski's private card. "It's Frank Dalton. I want to send that message." The meeting was arranged for the next evening at a location Kowalski chose, a boat ramp on the far side of the lake, isolated enough for privacy, but public enough to avoid the appearance of anything illegal. I arrived first, parking my truck where I could see the entire area, but couldn't easily be approached without warning. The sun was setting behind pine trees that had stood here long before any of us were born, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me why Margaret had loved this place. 2 vehicles arrived exactly on time, Kowalski's unmarked sedan and a black SUV with tinted windows. 3 men got out of the SUV, moving with the controlled precision of people who had worked together before. They weren't young, weren't obviously threatening, just quietly competent in a way that suggested serious professional experience. "Mr. Dalton," the oldest of them said, extending his hand, "I'm Michael Torres. Detective Kowalski says you have a problem that needs solving." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze. "My son owes money to people who think they can collect it through me. And you'd prefer they reconsider that approach." "I'd prefer they understand that I'm not an easy target." Torres nodded approvingly. "Clarity is useful. What outcome are you looking for?" "I want them to leave me alone, permanently. I want my son to understand that his debts are his problem, not mine. And I want anyone else who might be watching to know that Frank Dalton isn't someone you threaten without consequences. That can be arranged. But, Mr. Dalton, once we send this kind of message, there's no taking it back. Are you prepared for your relationship with your son to be over permanently?" I looked out at the lake where Margaret and I had shared so many peaceful evenings, where we'd planned a retirement that would never come, where I'd learned to be alone without being lonely. My relationship with my son ended the moment he decided I was something to be managed, rather than someone to be respected. Then we understand each other. The rest of the conversation was brief and professional. Terms were agreed upon, methods were discussed, timelines established. When it was over, I shook hands with men whose names I would never know, and whose methods I would never have to understand in detail. I drove home through darkness that felt different than it had before. Not threatening, but expectant, like the calm before a storm that would clear the air permanently. 2 days later, Harold called with news that the trust had been finalized and recorded. Both properties now belong to the Frank Dalton Family Trust. with provisions that would keep them protected regardless of what happened to me personally. "Congratulations," he said. "You're now officially property poor and legally bulletproof." That same afternoon, Ethan called. His voice was different, smaller, uncertain, stripped of the confident manipulation I'd grown to recognize. "Dad, we need to talk." "I don't think we do. Please, just 5 minutes. There are some things you don't understand about my situation." "I understand enough. The people I owe money to, they're not reasonable people. If they can't collect from me, they'll find other ways, other targets. Not my problem. Dad, they know where you live. They know you're alone. If something happens to you because of my debts, nothing's going to happen to me, Ethan. But if something were to happen to anyone else because of those debts, well, let's just say I've made some new friends who take that kind of thing personally." The silence that followed was profound. "What did you do?" "I solved a problem. The way men used to solve problems before they started asking permission from people who wanted to steal from them." "Dad, this conversation is over. Don't call this number again." I hung up and turned off the phone for the last time. 3 weeks later, Marcus called to report that Ethan's creditors had suddenly become very understanding about payment schedules and very uninterested in alternative collection methods. The midnight visitors stopped coming. The threatening letters ceased arriving. Sometimes, I learned, the best way to end a war is to demonstrate that you're prepared to fight it with tools your enemies don't possess. That November, I received one final communication from my suit. Not a phone call or a threatening letter, but a formal document delivered by certified mail. A complete renunciation of any claim to my estate, present or future, signed and notarized and legally binding. He was cutting all ties, financial and emotional, probably at the suggestion of lawyers who understood that continuing to harass a man with my new connections would be unwise. I filed the document in the folder with everything else, then carried the entire collection to the fireplace. Margaret had always said that some chapters of life needed to be closed with ceremony rather than simply abandoned. I burned it all, the threats, the manipulation, the evidence of betrayal, and watched the smoke carry away the last remnants of the family I'd thought I had. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell if this story resonated with you. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. That winter, I settled into a routine that would have been impossible under their supervision. I read books Margaret had recommended, but I'd never had time for. I learned to cook meals for one without feeling sorry for myself. I made new friends among the year-round lake residents, people who valued competence over age and independence over compliance. Spring brought new growth in Margaret's herb garden, which I'd decided to maintain not as a shrine, but as a practical matter. Fresh basil and oregano made even simple meals taste like celebrations. On what would have been our 33rd wedding anniversary, I sat on the dock with my morning coffee and Margaret's photograph, watching the sun turn the water into liquid gold. "I fought for what mattered," I told her image. "I protected what we built together. I hope that makes you proud." The only answer was the sound of water lapping against the dock, and the call of a loon somewhere across the lake, wild and free and completely untamed. It was enough. It was more than enough. That afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found something unexpected. A postcard from Florida. No return address, just a picture of a beach at sunset and a single sentence on the back. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others. E." I studied the handwriting, comparing it to the threatening letters I'd burned months ago. Different hand, different ink, different intent entirely. I put the postcard in my shirt pocket and continued my walk around the property that was mine again, truly mine, protected by legal structures that would outlast whatever remained of my natural life. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something you granted or withheld. It was something that became irrelevant when you stopped needing it to feel whole. The sun was setting over the lake as I returned to the cabin, painting the sky in colors that changed too quickly to photograph, but slowly enough to appreciate. I made dinner for one, ate it at the table Margaret and I had shared, and felt grateful for the silence that was no longer empty, but full of possibilities I was free to choose for myself. The war was over. The house was mine. The future, whatever remained of it, belonged to no one but me. Margaret's letter was still in my wallet, her final words a reminder that some victories were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Make me proud. I had done exactly that. As the grandfather clock in the living room chimed 9 times, the same clock Margaret and I had bought at an estate sale 20 years ago, the one that had marked every important moment of our marriage, I realized that the most perfect revenge wasn't destruction or humiliation or even justice. It was peace. The deep, unshakable peace of a man who'd refused to be diminished, who'd fought for his dignity when everyone else expected him to surrender it, who'd chosen freedom over family when family meant chains. Outside, the lake held the last light of day like a promise kept. Inside, the house settled around me with the satisfied sigh of a structure that knew it was properly owned, properly loved, properly protected. Thank you for joining me on this journey of reclaiming dignity and independence. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your own thoughts about fighting for what matters most. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to lose what makes you who you are. I poured myself a glass of water, clean, honest, untainted, and raised it to Margaret's photograph. To endings that are really beginnings, I said to her smile, and to the courage to choose your own story, even when everyone else thinks they know how it should end. The clock chimed 10 times, marking another day in a life that was finally, completely, indisputably my own. It was the best sound I'd heard in months,